I'm Joanne Banko, online educator at Let's Go Sew. Today I have a great project for you today. I can't wait to show you everything I have here. We're going to be talking about fleece, and we're going to talk about making a coat out of fleece. So let me talk first about the fabric. I love this type of fleece, polar type fleece we call it, and it's everywhere today. I mean, it's been around for so long. It's one of the greatest fabrics, I think, of modern life. But I have particular types that I like, and the ones that I've brought here and made my jacket out of are from fabric that is actually sold in different weights. So typically it comes in a 100 weight, a 200 weight, and a 300 weight. And as you can imagine, the 100, which I have here, is a little bit thinner and a little bit softer. And then the 200 weight we would consider a medium weight. And then I don't have a sample of the 300, but the 300 is even a little bit heavier. So one of my favorites for a jacket is the 200. This fabric does have a definite right and wrong side, but it's very, very attractive both on the wrong side and on the right side. But sometimes, depending on the color or the piece that you get, it may be a little bit tricky to figure out which is right and which is wrong. So I got a quick tip for you on that. Simply pull the fabric along the selvage, and then if you could see what's happening there, it's curling. So the wrong side always curls to the right side. So I know this is the right side of the fabric. Now, when we're cutting out a garment, we need to be concerned about direction. So this fabric does have nap. It's a little bit smoother one way or the other. Color-wise, it doesn't look much different, but you do want to maintain the same nap throughout. So you would cut all of your pieces. For example, if I determine this is the top, all of the pieces I'm going to use this as the top. So make sure you do that, and then if you need to mark it, make sure you mark it so that once you get your patterns taken off, if you can't tell on a piece, you want to make sure you know which is the top edge and which is the bottom edge. All right, so let's talk about patterns. Don't shy away from something that's a little bit more tailored, but be mindful of the closure. You know, a lot of these fleece type garments are generally loose fitting and pullovers, but I like to make something a little bit more tailored. I'm going to teach you some tricks on that today. But when you look at the pattern, first of all, look at the lines on the pattern, because that'll show you where there are seams. It'll be a little bit more evident, you know, how the closure works, if there's cuffs or any issues like that you want to be aware of those details. That doesn't always show up on the photograph. And when you look, you might see tie belts, things like that. That's another great closure. But I like to shy away from buttonholes, especially on the heavier fleece, and opt for either like a toggle closure or a button and a loop. You can use snaps. I'm going to teach you a really cute trick today that you can use for a closure as an option. But cutting fabric, that's another thing I want to give you a few tips on. I love to use a rotary cutter when I am cutting almost anything, but when you're cutting through fleece, it really helps because you just, you know, you slice really straight lines and you don't have jagged edges when you use your scissors. If you do use scissors, just make sure you use a long sweep of the scissors and use a nice big pair. Flat pins are great because you could pin your layers together and then you could put your ruler right over the top of it. All right, so let's head over to the machine. I got a bunch of little techniques to show you so you can create a jacket. We are going to start at the serger. So I'm going to spin around over here, grab a swatch of fabric, and if your pattern itself has a 5/8 inch seam, then you would want to pre-trim it in order to serge it. But I'm going to just use a 1/4 inch seam here, was about what the serger gives us, because you are going to find some patterns have a 1/4 inch seam allowance for pullovers and fleece type garments. And the serger does an ideal job of doing that. So let's flip over to this side, and I'll show you my finished effect here. Okay? What is the advantage of using a serger on fleece? Well, with a 4-thread stitch, you've got that extra needle line there. It helps put pressure on the fabric and just kind of smooshes it down, so it creates a nice seam. And you've got still stretch factor, and then when you open that up, that thread is just buried in the texture of the fabric, creates a really nice smooth seam. So let me show you this sample where I've got just a little different color so you can see a really, really clear view of that. Now, another thing you're going to find on some edges, you're going to use a single layer. Fleece does not ravel, it does not fray. Technically, you don't have to finish it at all, but I'm going to show you I like to finish at least my seams, and even before I do a hem. But if you wanted to, you certainly could use your serger just as an edge finish and clean finish that entire edge and leave that as your hem, or turn that up, or use that as anywhere you want to. So the first thing I want to show you is just a normal standard seam. When we stitch a seam on this fabric, we are going to want to just use a regular straight stitch. I'm using a regular foot. I'll talk about the walking foot in a minute here. But I absolutely positively want to increase my stitch length. And I usually go all the way to about 3.5, which seems like a really long stitch length, but it allows for the bulk of the fabric to flow through easier. One more thing, I usually make a change. I usually go into my presser foot pressure setting, if I have that option, and I lighten that up a little bit. That puts a little bit less pressure on the fabric so that as I'm stitching, and I'm using my 5/8 inch seam guide here, but as I'm stitching, it doesn't prohibit the fabric from flowing through really easily. I'm not using a stretch stitch. In fact, I do not recommend using a stretch stitch. If you did need to take this seam out or alter it, the stretch stitch is a little too difficult to rip out. So beautiful seam. That thread gets buried right in there. Believe it or not, I've got yellow thread in there and you can't even see it. You'd want to use matching thread, of course. But when you open that up, it again is buried in there. Now, what about pressing? Pressing is never, ever, ever done on polar fleece. So a simple finger press will do it. And that's nice, but if you want to keep that laying flat, that's where I incorporate a few tailoring techniques. So one of my favorite things to do is just to simply, I'm going to take this same piece, let's get this guide out of the way here, and I like to top stitch it. So when I'm doing top stitching, I will use the edge of the presser foot. I will usually actually lengthen my stitch just another half, so it's a little bit longer, and I will change my stitch width position to 5.5. That's going to give me 1/4 inch from the edge of the foot to the stitching line. And look at that, smooth like butter. Just goes right through, and I've got a really, really nice finish there. I just flip that to the other side. And again, I've got 1/4 inch there. So we're going to have a little bit of bulk there, and I'm going to show you how to deal with that in just a minute. Okay. And you know, it's funny to look at it, but take a look at this one done with the yellow thread, this one done with thread that matches my fabric. Almost no difference, but this is my finished sample. Because I want to flip this one over and show you what I would do next. I've got that 5/8 inch seam, which is going to add a little bit of bulk. We don't need that bulk anymore. So I go in with my scissors and trim really close to the stitching line from the wrong side so that it's a little bit smoother, a little bit flatter, and a little less bulk from the right side. So you can see where my excess is still there. Now, what about curves? Well, when we do curves, such as a collar, you see on the jacket, it's got a really big collar on it. You're going to need to really trim away that bulk, and then it's going to be time to top stitch it. So I've got this one pre-trimmed after I sewed that 5/8 inch seam. I'm going to trim one edge really, really close. Remember, fleece doesn't ravel, so you don't have to worry about that. The next one, I'm going to actually trim a little bit less, but when you trim it, here's the trick. Always make sure and see which side is going to flip to be the top side of your collar. So when you're looking at the garment on, you want that side to have a wider seam allowance than the underside. So you can see that's tucked underneath there. This one would be trimmed as well, but it would be trimmed a little bit less, so that when I smooth that down and top stitch it, I've got a little bit larger layer on the top side. So that would be my next step. And this is where you're going to use your fingers a little bit. And again, just finger press that. Now, if we didn't top stitch this, let me slide that underneath, then we are going to have an issue with the fabric rolling. And that's going to, not give you that really, really pretty effect. So you can stitch 1/4 inch, you can stitch 1/2 inch, whatever you like. I like usually a little bit wider from the, the distance there. But that flattens that out, makes it really, really, really smooth. So what about pockets? Lots of times you're going to have pockets. In fact, if you're anything like me, you don't want to live without those pockets. So for pockets, I've got another stitch and another technique that's going to give it a really nice tailored look. You wouldn't expect it, but I am selecting an overcast stitch. And I'm going to increase it to the widest width possible, and I'm going to increase that length a little bit. And then I've stabilized this with water-soluble stabilizer so that I can go across that edge, and I want that stitch to skip right along the outside. Let's just do a little bit of this. My pins are help stabilizing that. Okay, trim this and let you see that. Look what a beautiful finish that is. You could do it on the top edge, bottom edge, or all the way around. My seam is my pocket actually is sewn into the seam. So let's pop back over here at the table and look at just a couple more details. I've got a great cording technique that I stretch the fabric and then zigzag over it. It creates great little loops. You could see my finished pocket there, and look at these great little toggle closures. So that makes a really, really nice finish. So lots of different fleece techniques. You can make top stitched belts, you can finish with toggle closures, you can make a beautiful, beautiful jacket.